Well, by surprisingly popular demand, I guess it's time for more dwarf stories. I had a couple more reviews in the works simultaneously, but the people have spoken, so here's this sequel before I move on to new things. I teased a story in the first Dwarf Fortress video, and I'd better deliver on that first. It's another of the legends from Gem Spears, the tale of the vampire and the Minotaur. During the golden age of Gem Spears, before the attack of the forgotten beast Lene, there was an arena constructed in one of the shallowest underground levels, right by the farmland. It was a square surrounded on all sides by a 10-story deep pit, and dwarves would pit all kinds of captured beasts against one another in this arena. Now, I don't know how much experience you have with dwarven arenas, but security measures must be put in place when constructing one. For example, say a couple of wild animals are dropped into the ring, but they would rather run for their lives than fight each other. To prevent that, you need a retractable bridge leading to the arena. Or say you pit a goblin against a pack of wolves, and the goblin wins. Well, what is the goblin going to do immediately after achieving victory? Run deeper into the fort and terrorize your dwarves, of course. That, or try to escape with his life, an equally unforgivable crime. And maybe the military dwarves are too busy to enter the arena and award him his ceremonial beheading. Maybe the citizens would rather see this champion fight another day. For these concerns, you need cage traps blocking any exits from the arena. And every good dwarven project needs a complete failsafe in the event of unimaginable catastrophic failure. For this reason, the Gem Spears arena was held up by a single support, which could be collapsed at a moment's notice, likely killing whatever stands on top in the fall. Thankfully, that failsafe was never needed. One day in Gem Spears, a vampire dwarf was discovered. I know some dwarven governments value vampire citizens for their combat prowess and near immortality, but in Gem Spears, being a vampire was a crime punishable by death. This citizen was sentenced to trial by arena, his chosen opponent the recently captured Minotaur. The Minotaur had already proven his talents by dispatching several goblins at once, so I assumed he would have no trouble crushing a single unarmed dwarf, vampire or not. But due to the Minotaur's strategy of choice, the fight took an unexpected turn. They exchanged a few blows early in the fight, and the Minotaur appeared to have an obvious upper hand. That's when he made the decision to kill the vampire by strangulation. You may not know this, but vampires can live without breathing. It's an aspect of their immortality. So the Minotaur might have bruised the vampire's windpipe, but the loss of breath was no hindrance. If the Minotaur was a more clever beast, it might have given up on this plan and crushed the vampire's skull, or attacked it in some other way. Instead, it maintained that stranglehold as long as it possibly could. Through an unbelievably arduous process, taking probably days or weeks or even longer in-game time, the Minotaur maintained that stranglehold while the vampire feebly punched and kicked at its attacker. Finally, after the vampire had attained a legendary skill level in nearly every unarmed combat skill, he managed to kick the Minotaur so hard in the chest, one of its ribs broke and pierced a lung. At long last, the Minotaur died and released its hold on the vampire. A terrifying new champion emerged from the arena that day, and it was determined that a mere execution was not good enough for this intrepid fighter. Instead, he was confined to a tiny hut near the entrance of the fort, locked away until the citizens might need his help in combat. His assistance was appreciated, but he would never outlive the glory that he saw in the arena that day. For my next story, I'd like to talk about a long-dead fort. Unfortunately, because this fort did eventually collapse, I have no way of recording it, so here's some completely unrelated footage instead. This fort was settled in a nice grassy meadow by a peaceful little river. Nothing too extraordinary about it at first glance. Only after having lived in this new settlement for a few months did the dwarves come to learn about the evil weather that would occasionally plague the site. A brown, vile fog would occasionally billow in over the river, striking fear into the hearts of dwarves. For the first year or two, the vile fog was avoided entirely. The river was still accessible to the dwarves without the need to venture near that fog, so they were able to live in safety and never know what horrors might occur if they strayed too far. After all, stories had circulated from other forts about evil weather, causing dwarves to go blind, or for their skin to melt away, or any number of things. Finally, a day came that the dwarves did learn the effects of this evil weather. A recent immigrant had come to the fort, living the life of a fisher dwarf. He provided a valuable service to the citizens for a long time, until one day he chose to go fishing too far from home. The vile fog came billowing in, but this dwarf was too absorbed in his fishing to notice its approach. It engulfed him, and he was transformed into a vile fog zombie. Some obvious fears followed. Did he now hunger for dwarven flesh? Would he be filled with a hatred for all living things and terrorize the wild horses and birds that wandered the moors? Would he wreak havoc on the dwarven halls until all his former comrades were dead? Well, no. What did this vile fog zombie dwarf do instead? He continued fishing. It seems that he wasn't even aware that this fog had rolled in and transformed him into some horrible undead creature. So eventually he finished with his day's work and set off to carry his catches back to the fort. However, on the walk back he encountered a woodcutter dwarf. This moment would surely be a turning point. Would the sight of another dwarf fill him with rage and bloodlust? The woodcutter seemed to think so, because he immediately fled in terror. But rather than furiously pursue this dwarf, the vile fog zombie instead dropped his fish and ran away in the opposite direction. By some twist of fate, the fisher dwarf was not transformed into an undead beast full of hatred, but instead into a timid creature, afraid of what he once was. The fisher dwarf was just as afraid of his former comrades as they were of him. For this reason, there didn't seem to be any problem in letting him continue to live his life. Months went by with this vile fog zombie fisher dwarf still occupying the foggy moors. He continued with his fishing and would periodically try to deliver his catches back to the fortress, but each time he would be scared away by the sight of other dwarves. Other citizens would occasionally wander outside and find the fish he would drop on the ground and carry them inside. So in this unconventional way he was still helping the fort, and in a way he was something of a local folk legend. Wander out near the river on a foggy morning and you just might catch a glimpse of the zombie fisher dwarf about his work. How else do you explain the fish found along the banks of the river every morning? I wish I could say that the story ends here, that the zombie fisher dwarf continued to live out his days in quiet obscurity down the far reaches of the river. Sadly, it was not so. One day, a dwarven caravan was visiting from the mountain homes to conduct trade with this settlement. By coincidence, the zombie fisher dwarf was also making one of his periodic attempts to deliver a recent catch to the fort. But this time, instead of being scared away at the sight of a mere civilian dwarf, he caught the eye of one of the caravan guards. This Mace dwarf, seeing what could only have been a threatening monster, pursued the creature immediately. All across the fortress grounds, this zombie fisher dwarf fled. Even after several strikes from the mace, he made no attempt to strike back against a fellow dwarf. He eventually found himself cornered with no escape, and up to his final moments he never lifted a hand to attack the guard who killed him. I wondered then what would happen to the vile fog zombie fisher dwarf, if the citizens saw his death as the welcome end to a long-time nuisance, if they would make any attempt to dispose of the corpse or leave him to rot. Somewhat to my surprise, the moment the dwarves caught word of the fisher dwarf's death, they walked outside, collected his broken body, and gave him a traditional dwarven burial in a stone coffin deep in the halls. Despite the twisted monster he had become, the dwarves still saw him as one of their own in their hearts. You might be wondering how that fort did eventually meet its end. Unfortunately, it was nothing so dramatic or poetic as the story of that lone fisher dwarf. Basically, this vile fog eventually captured a small group of ravens, and when they became vile fog zombie ravens, they wandered into the fort and slowly killed all the dwarves. Every citizen was enlisted into the military to fight them away, but with no real weapons, the ravens were nearly impossible to kill. It was a fairly short-lived fort. Another somewhat smaller legend comes from gem spears again. One of that fort's greatest treasures was a silver mace. I'm sure you know, occasionally dwarves will be overcome by a strange mood, and they must drop everything until they are able to complete a strange artifact that occupies their every thought. Most of the time it isn't anything too spectacular. A floodgate, a mechanism, a figurine. They might be ornate and beautiful, but not always functional. Well, one day a weaponsmith of gem spears found himself so possessed, and he used this moment of inspiration to craft a silver mace of the finest quality. Now, silver is a choice metal for any mace due to its unusual weight, but this one was exceptional. I mean, look at it. It has images of a dwarf in silver and an image of a forgotten beast in llama wool. What more do you need to know the wild history of gem spears? Naturally, this national treasure was given to the most talented mace dwarf in the gem spears military, whom I had nicknamed Shook, after a fellow Dwarf Fortress player. Shook rose to incredible glory with the help of this unparalleled mace, and over a long military career he attained over 130 confirmed kills on the battlefield. He was there for the Battle of Lenne, survived the ensuing plague of beast rot, and continued life in the above-ground fort. Shook was a legendary hero of legendary heroes. To this day his military accolades are unmatched. However, I must sadly say that he is no longer with us. He sustained wounds from goblin invaders one day, and unfortunately died when his wounds became infected. Gem Spears was new to the above-ground life and had not yet rebuilt the soap-making industry. Never let the importance of proper sterilization be understated. But on his deathbed, Shook's legendary mace was mysteriously absent. It was eventually discovered that he had dropped it in the river after he was wounded in battle. It could never be recovered due to dwarves' well-known aversion to water, and it still rests in the riverbed to this day. Perhaps one day, a dwarf mighty enough, and worthy enough of legend, will be able to retrieve the pride of gem spears from the bottom of the river. Even my very first fort was worthy of a story or two. To this day, I'm not sure how it happened, but the first fort I ever founded in Dwarf Fortress was never assailed by a single goblin attack. It was a fine backdrop to be able to learn the game in peace, but didn't provide much excitement in the late game. This was before the days when natural subterranean caves had been implemented in the game, so there wasn't even any excitement to seek in the deep underground. In fact, the masterfully trained military only ever received one test of their abilities. It was the world's worst dragon. It was a thrill to see it arrive on the borders of the fort at first, perhaps a challenge after all this peace, but somehow this dragon was missing a foot when it arrived. It wasn't exactly the most menacing thing. It also seemed to suffer from a severe case of narcolepsy because it would periodically fall unconscious as it approached the fort. I tried to hold the military back so that they could savor this challenge. The fortress had gone years with no challenge to its might, and it might be a long time before they see the same level of excitement. The dragon occupied itself with a stray cat wandering outside the fort, chasing it across the hills and breathing fire at it, but even this was too much for the dragon to handle. The cat was safely able to escape the dragon, who fell unconscious again right before the fort's moat. At this point, the soldiers couldn't contain their excitement anymore, and pounced on the dragon before it could react. It was wrestled to death within seconds. No dwarven casualties. I would have a lot more stories, but I lost the old text document I had compiled several years ago. In a process of reinstalling new operating systems and reformatting hard drives and installing new hard drives, the file somehow got lost to the ages. But there's one more story I can relate. How about the story of my current YouTube channel artwork? I don't remember much about this particular fort. It was mildly prosperous, but certainly no gem spears. It had some clever traps near the entryway, some cage traps and a collapsing bridge leading down to a death pit. The military was fairly well trained, and they used captured goblins as part of their training exercises. The carpenters had plenty of work to keep them occupied, mass-producing wooden cages to stockpile more and more prisoners. Really, there's no better practice for a military dwarf than hands-on combat experience. So the dwarves engineered a way to set up these goblin cages 1, 2, maybe 3 at a time, and release them into the barracks where the soldiers were sparring. Any goblin who could escape the fort alive was allowed to flee, but no goblin ever escaped alive. Well, one day a dragon came to attack this fort, and this dragon was no pitiful narcoleptic invalid. It was a full-fledged destroyer of forts. The first dwarf to learn of its arrival was a hunter, who happened to be napping in the grass near the borders of the fort. She was melted almost instantly. No corpse left to recover. Fire spread across the land, and the dwarves fled inside. Despite the well-trained military, I was unsure how well the dwarves could handle this situation. I thought it would be best to hold the soldiers at bay for some time, and perhaps the dragon would fall victim to some traps near the entrance. The soldiers were holed up in their barracks, which was just 1 or 2 floors below the surface. But much to the horror of that militia, the dragon's fire soon spread underground, to the goblin prison. As you can imagine, wooden cages do not hold up well against dragon fire. Thankfully, the dwarves' armor protected them well, but they were soon assailed by a raving horde of flaming goblins and trolls. It was chaos in the barracks. Flames on one end, dozens of freed goblins with axes to grind on the other. A few dwarves died that day, and a few enemies of the fort might have escaped in the confusion. But as for the dragon, he was captured.